Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Howard and Kathy for helping to speak at this year's Time Symposium. Oh, great, thank you. So, Richard Cranch, what an extraordinary individual. And I really have to think, let's just start here. I call this the Richard Cranch Project because this is an incredible story. Richard Cranch, up until 2021, Richard Cranch was a completely unknown colonial watchmaker and largely forgotten historical figure until Robert Mussey, who is here, contacted NWCC and offered all his research on Cranch. What an extraordinary offer, plus the fact that we didn't know about him until 3 years ago. It's crazy. Now, Mr. Mussey is not really a horologist. He had run a high-end furniture restoration business, and his interest was in post-colonial cabinet makers. And he wrote 2 fabulous volumes on John and Thomas Seymour and Isaac Vose. Incredible books, if you ever get a chance to read them. Incredible research, photography, and documentation. Makes my work pale compared to them. But he offered this research on this incredible person. And it turns out that he found some Cranch letters and said, wow, this guy's pretty interesting, probably in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And then he found around the country, there are caches of Cranch family letters dating from 1730 to late 19th century. He went to these places, photographed them, and transcribed them. So we have hundreds of letters from the Cranch family, even Richard, people writing about the Cranches. And then he's in Boston. He lives in Boston area. He's in the Bostonian Society. He's going through the library, and he's looking in this Dawes Greenleaf collection because the Cranches had married into these families, and there's a book that was ascribed to the Daweses. And he opens the book up, and it's signed, boldly, this book belongs to Richard Cranch, Hanover Street, Boston, March 27th, 1769, establishing him. He was a colonial watchmaker prior to the Revolutionary War. Extraordinary work. So Crazy Me said, wow, this is cool. So I've taken up the project of all this information that Robert provided in writing a book. And the book is in the process. It's a slow process. So today is just a short snapshot, a little bit about Richard, and a few insights that I've learned from his Daybook. So hope you enjoy it. So this is the opening page in his Daybook that establishes this belonged to Richard, and he was a colonial watchmaker, and prior to the Revolutionary War. So a little bit of a bio on Richard. He was born in Kingsbridge, Devonshire, England, 1726. He was the youngest of 7. Now, the Cranch family had been involved with the wool industry for many, many generations, literally. And Richard was studying to be a wool card maker. And wool card is one way you process wool before you spin it. But he says, I want to get out of here. So he's not quite 20 years old, and he wants to emigrate to the United States, to the colonies. So he and his older sister, Mary, and she's recently married to Joseph Palmer, they boarded a ship in the fall of 1746, arrived in Boston in November of 1746. And they were trying to establish a business with these wool cards, so they thought they could sell these wool cards in Boston. They must have talked to some people. They thought they could make more money selling them than they could sell in the UK. They started a business, but it doesn't go well. They can't sell them. This is the problem with these colonial industries. They struggle. So, in the process, in 1750, this smallpox epidemic sweeps through Boston, and a lot of people die, get very sick, and they go like, hey, this isn't really healthy. So, a couple of years later, they actually relocate to Braintree, which is 8 miles southeast, away from that pestilence. Well, in that same time period, there are a number of individuals are setting up colonial industries in Braintree. And Cranch and Palmer jump in with both feet. They buy property, they establish working on a glass-making operation and a spermaceti whale oiling processing and candle making. Turns out whale oil is the good quality whale oil is the premier lighting source in the colonies and in the UK. And whale oil candles, manically, those are the high-end candles. So they're prized. So if you can process whale oil and make good quality candles, you can sell them. Well, they struggle with these industries, and the 19th century they said, these industries were failures, yada, yada, yada. But, they were facing a tough time. The British government was really opposed to colonial industries. There was no money. How do you find workers? And once you get product, how to distribute it? Boy, the same problems today, right? After post-COVID. But anyhow, they made a go at these industries, and now I think it was important because the letters I read, you get a sense that Richard's a pretty sharp guy technically. And so, but outside of business, so he's trying to run these business, but he's a voracious reader. He's actually a self-taught intellectual. He is a Bible scholar. I mean, he probably could converse with the smartest reverends of the day because they seemed like they respected him. There was one big handicap was he had very poor business sense, and there's a lot of stories about that. But let's just say that was just one big Achilles heel. But so he's working in Braintree. He does spend some time in a little town called Weymouth, 6 miles south of Braintree, and he meets Reverend William Smith. That's the local pastor. He gets along with all these ministers very well. They must have respected him. And Reverend Smith has 3 daughters, Mary, the oldest, middle daughter, Abigail, and the youngest, Elizabeth. And they quickly that they like Cranch, Cranch likes him, but he takes a liking to the oldest daughter, Mary, and begins courting her in the early part of 1759. Well, about July of 1759, he invites his best friend, John Adams. These guys are BFF for their entire life. Says, hey, John, I'm going to introduce you to the middle daughter, Abigail. I think you might like her. So John tags along with him, took the horse ride down. There was a weekly run. They made a weekly trip down to visit the Smiths. And so he meets Abigail, and they don't hit it right away, but they eventually do. But interesting enough, Abigail is probably the smartest of the 3 daughters. And she is so frustrated because she can't have good reading. So Cranch is bringing her books and plays and classic stuff, and she said about Cranch, he opened my eyes to the classics. And we know that she wrote, and John wrote, hundreds and hundreds of letters. We learned a lot about that Cranch from their letters. But anyhow, so 3 years later, Cranch marries Mary Smith, and 2 years later, John Adams marries Abigail. So he marries into this extended Smith-Adams family, family was important in those days because there was no social network. So you had a struggle that you could rely on family, and they had relatives scattered all over Boston. So you wanted to go someplace, there was no holiday inns, right? So you go visit family. So they would travel back and forth and stay with friends. So that was sort of the early part of his life. But even from when he was when he first started in Boston, friends would call him a clockmaker and a watchmaker. He knew Gawain Brown after Brown came to Boston in 1749. Brown actually cut him a wheel in 1750. So I don't know what Richard was doing, but he was tinkering around with horology. He also owns some important English and French horology books. So he was taught. So he was a voracious reader. So he learned by reading. So things hadn't gone well in Braintree. So he said, something, I think I can make a go as a watch repairer. So he moves his family from Braintree to this little city of Salem, north of Boston, along the coast. Prosperous town because of the maritime. And there's another town called Marblehead, 4 miles away. So there's a lot of potential customers that are wealthy. He starts his business. It doesn't go real well. So he decides to move to Boston. So, it's really We don't know why he failed, didn't do it, but it wasn't until many, many years later that there was actually some successful watch repairers in Salem, so it indicated maybe it wasn't as good a market as he thought. So he comes back to Boston in November 1767 and opens up his shop on this Hanover Street. And then 2 years later, he acquires this account book, this Daybook. He has this Daybook, which basically records the watches takes and repairs. And so, I'm not sure if you remember your colonial history was, beginning in 1768, the British, they started garrisoning troops in Boston. So it became a very contentious time period. And things got worse and worse and worse and worse with time. So they actually shut the port of Boston down in 1774 because of the Boston Tea Party. So Cranch is hanging in there trying to keep this watch repair business going. So on April 12th, 1775, he says, I had it, I'm out of here. He moves to Braintree. That's 1 week before the Battle of Concord Lexington, which is basically the opening salvo of the Revolutionary War. So, he hangs in there for quite a while in Boston through this tough time period. So, Rich and Mary move to Braintree. Okay, so what do? So they rent a house. It's a boarding house. Richard is tutoring young students to go to Harvard because there's no real educational system there. He knows all the Harvard presidents. He probably knows all the professors. And they know, well, okay, hey kids, you got to learn Greek, you got to learn Latin, you got to learn all this stuff to go to Harvard, because that's the big school in Boston. Harvard or go to Yale. And so if dad's fairly wealthy, he wants his kid to go to Harvard, or if he wants to be a minister. So, okay, what else did you do during the war? Well, the economies and people just strut. It's a real struggle to get through. It was really a tough time. So he's doing everything he can to make money. So actually, he serves as a representative in Braintree in the Massachusetts, in the House and the Senate. He actually signs bills, which are notes to help generate money, more like a bond, generate money for the war effort. They needed some judges for the Court of Common Pleas, so John says, "Hey, rich people know you. You're honest. Put your name in there." Well, he's not a trained lawyer, but he gets appointed as a judge. He has a small farm. Mary has milks cows. So anything you can do to survive, eke a meager existence, and he does that. But Howard must respect him because he was given an honorary MA in 1780. Wow. They create the American Academy of Sciences and Arts in 1781. He gets nominated and accepted. I mean, this is just a guy that not self-educated. People respected him. The war kind of comes to an end. It's a real tough time. And then in 1788, he decides to restart his watch repair business. And then a few years later, he gets contacts to start retailing watches. That's a great story, by the way. And then in 1792, they split off the North Parish of Quincy, from Braintree, and it's called Quincy. And one time, Adams is very careful about patronage jobs. And he finally gets one safe one for Cranch. He gets him appointed postmaster in Quincy, which he holds that job until he dies in 1811. So it's, do anything to survive these rough times. So that's a little bit about Richard. So here's a portrait of Richard, pen and ink sketch. We're not sure who it was done. Probably may have been his son, but it was late 1790s. So it's a reasonable reference to what he looks like. There is one Verge watch signed Richard Cranch, Boston 501. Obviously, it's an English watch. He probably made some contacts. He made contacts with retailers in London, and they probably he ordered it with his name on there. But there's at least one watch signed Richard Cranch. There's at least one clock on the dial signed Richard Cranch, Boston. So How many watches he retailed, how many clocks he made, we don't know, but at least one of each have survived, thank goodness, with his name on there. He also, this is one of his horological books. It's Alexander Cummings book from 1766, and it's signed on the front page Richard Cranch. And a couple of years after he died, they inventoried his collection. This book was acquired by William Cranch Bond. Well, most interestingly enough, William Cranch Bond's father, William Bond, who was the first generation of the clockmakers, he married Cranch's niece Hannah in 1777. They moved to what was Falmouth, Maine, now Portland, I don't know, about 1787 or something like that. But there's a lot of letters between Cranch and William Bond that survived, incredible. And then Bond moved to Boston. Well, 1819, William Cranch Bond, their older son, he goes to England, I don't know, on business or what, and he meets and marries his first cousin, Selina Bond, in Devonshire. And sorry, I've been talking about the William Cranch Bond a little bit later on, but it's amazing. There's two generational connections between the Bond family and the Cranch. And a lot of letters are existing, which is amazing. So here's a map of Boston from 1796 showing Cranch's shop. So here, let me do this. So this is the north end. This would be called the north end of Boston, and this is Hanover Street. I don't like to do this. It's still there in Boston. We call it the Government Center, and his shop was someplace south of this Mill Bridge. Don't know where exactly, because they didn't number anything. So, and so when he moves to Boston, this is an ad he posted in the Boston Evening Post on December 7th, 1767, and he's talking about his repair practice, but he's also focusing on his former customers in Salem. He said, listen guys, I got my business going here in repair business in Boston. Listen, if you want your watch repaired, I've contracted Mr. Boardman, who travels back and forth between Boston and Salem 3 times a week by coach. Give the watch to him, he will bring it to me, I repair it, I won't charge you for transportation. It's like, wow. One thing is, we talked about this, Rich mentioned watches. A Verge watch was someone's prized possession. To give it to a total stranger to bring it from Salem to Boston. So Mr. Boardman must have been some sort of a reputable courier to do this. And so this is something I wish we find there are more people that did this, but it was interesting that he offered this service to his potential customers. How many we took advantage of it, we don't know, but Mr. Boardman must have been a trusted person. Maybe he would carry documents or money, but to transport, that's a dangerous job in some respects, to transport valuable items back and forth. So this Daybook, this is basically a customer list. So when the watch came in, he'd record the watchmaker's name, where he was located, serial number. Then he would record the customer's name, sometimes the title, where he or she lived, and some comments. Most of the time it was like Mr. Smith, Mr. Jones. So it's tough, but was able to identify a number of his customers. But it's quite an extraordinary book. So it's 201 pages long. Unfortunately, some of the Dawes relatives later on made it a scrapbook. So over the first 8 pages, they pasted these newspaper articles which obliterate his repair stuff. However, beginning in May of 1769 to November of 1774, which is 5.5 years, you can see all the watches he took in for repairs. This is extraordinary. He took in 3,750 watches for repair in 5.5 years. So that was a very busy repair shop. We know he had some help, but they were processing a huge number of watches, about 600 a year. In 1773, they processed 956 watches for repair. That's a lot of watches that people, now obviously they came in many of these watches had 4 and 5 and 6 repairs on them, but it was amazing that he was a really, really busy guy, because, you know, they didn't work Sundays, so, you know, he had a business, he was retailing items, so, you know, they were, when do you work with customer watches and trying to service customers? So that was a very, very busy time. So this is one page of the Daybook. I chose it because this is from October 1769. Interesting, because on this page he records working on 3 Gaywen Brown, originally retail watches. Now, Gaywen Brown was a significant clockmaker and watchmaker and retailer in Boston in that time period. And even one watch was number 214, was owned by Dr. Joseph Warren. He was a famous Patriot leader, killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So it's like, and again, he was one of the early physicians in Boston and was well respected. So Cranch knew, worked with many people. So Mr. Mussey took all this information and transcribed it into Excel. So this is one quick, grab one little section of it. So what an incredible collection of information. So I added a couple of columns to it, and I copied over the watchmaker and owner's names, just edited it just so they would have the last name, so I could search it. Because when you start searching, you can really find some very interesting information. So what was it? One of the things I was going through it, like, where were these watches produced? And I wrote produced/retailed. Because we talked about that today. Rich talked about that. You know, the mass majority were English. They were signed in London. Well, they probably were made in, you know, Liverpool, and they were maybe finished in London, or we don't know. But they were mostly signed in London. However, there were 19 references to French watches, obviously different. There was some 18 references to watches from Dublin, obviously English. There was 2 watches from Amsterdam and 1 from Geneva. So again, they were virtually all American, but there were a few from the continent. But there are also a number of watches retailed in the colonies. So he worked on 24 different Gaywen Brown watches, 6 from Moses Pope, 1 from Samuel Bagnell, and 1 from Mr. Duffield from Philadelphia. And you know, Bob has talked about Duffield yesterday, so it's interesting that somehow a Duffield watch, Philadelphia, made its way to Boston. Fortunately, we have no information on who owned that watch or information on it, but there was at least, you know, one retail Duffield watch. I searched by again, I talked about retailers, makers. There was really a good connection between the London, you know, sellers and the Boston retailers. And so this, you know, John Billings watch, he sold watches. You know, Cranch worked on 11 Billings watches. This John and Devereux Bowley, which were some, again, were they related? Don't know, but they did quite a few watches. There was a number of these T-Butt London watches. And 7 years ago, I found this account book from Samuel Bemis Henry Ford Museum, documenting his actual repair work. He worked on a number of T-Butt watches. So T-Butt and the Butt family, they were, again, prolific retailers of watches into the Boston area. He was a few years later. He was post-Revolutionary War. And there was this T. Gardner and Edward Hemming. So really, there was some good connections to get between these guys, between the colonies and London. So we did get enough information on some of his customers. So where did these owners live? And it was extraordinary how far the owners and our watches traveled to get repaired. So obviously, many were in the Boston area, Boston and Charlestown and Cambridge. We're across the river, which you can easily row to get to Cranch. But around here we call it the North Shore, all the small towns along the coast north of Boston, Salem, Beverly, Marblehead, 15, 20 miles. Many of those were possibly shipped, they came down by ship. but also all the small towns going north of Boston, straight north into the southern New Hampshire. So there, again, 50 miles, watch comes down to Boston to repair. And then along the South Shore, all little towns along the coast from like Weymouth and Braintree, where Cranch eventually lived, all down to Plymouth, again, 10 to 40 miles, and all little towns south, even Providence, Rhode Island, 50 miles. And then going west, you have the western suburbs, we think, say, in Waltham and Natick, 40 miles out to Worcester, 9 miles out to Springfield. He actually had a lot of customers in Nantucket. Now, Nantucket is, you go out Boston, you go straight far south, straight, say, east, then you swing way around Cape Cod because of the shoals. You have to swing way south to Nantucket. That's a pretty good boat ride out there. And also, even a watch came down from Rutland, Vermont, 180 miles. You know, 15 to 20 miles was a hard day of travel. So these watches traveled, or the owners traveled a long way. To see this guy in Boston, I mean, it's incredible that, you know, that, again, these are prized possessions. And so I don't know if they actually made a trip to Boston to see Richard, or someone moved them, but wow, it was amazing how far watches travel for repair. Again, this is you know, pre-Revolutionary War, and the roads weren't that good. He did record some professions. So, gee, ship's captain on a lot of watches. Well, boy, if you're navigating, if you're doing short voyages, watch is valuable for navigation and making sure you can, you know, if you're going out of a harbor, you need to know when the correct high tide is. You don't want to run aground. There are a lot of customers with the title Reverend. They were ministers. Well, you know, one way to get ahead at that time would be getting a degree as a minister. All the Harvard presidents were ministers. Harvard was started to train congregational ministers. And ministers had important roles in society. They may have done other things besides just being a simple minister, but but again, they would have to have some money to afford a watch. Doctors, again, they're taking patient signs. It's symptoms. That's very important. There were a lot of folks that had military titles, and I'm going like, wait a second now, these may be British soldiers. And I realized, no. I started trying to figure out who they were, and they were lieutenants and captains and majors and colonels. It turns out these are titles, armored titles from the service in the French and Indian War. And so this is an English tradition. If you served in the military, you left, you kept that title. I'm Captain so and so or whatever it was. But anyhow, so they were colonists, not British military. And a lot of wealthy merchants had watches. So really, it was an interesting time. How many people, that's so and so. Yeah, okay. Well, he can afford easily. So, but it's interesting that these folks that own these watches. There was some really. He must have known a lot of people. For example, there's 3 judges they worked on. So this Honorable William Cushing, he was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He became a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And then Arnold Benjamin Lynn, he was on the Massachusetts Supreme Court. He became Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice. And then the Samuel Niles, well, he was obliged in Boston and Braintree, friend of John Adams. So Cranch might have actually known Niles because Cranch knew, Cranch was a good buddy of Adams. And they were all drinking buddies in that time. They had to sit down and chat about, discuss politics and whatnot. And John Irving was a merchant in the Governor's Council. We have 2 Harvard Press presidents, Samuel Langdon and Samuel Locke, that he worked on their watches. Cranch probably knew those guys. This Dr. John Perkins, looked him up. He's an interesting physician because he was one of the first physicians that started looking at a person was sick. What are their symptoms? So he was doing a lot of, and it was different to actually be more scientific, look at how what was going on with their lives. And then, of course, this Honorable James Russell, who lived in Charlestown. Now, he was a merchant And Battle of Bunker Hill, the British retribution, they actually burned the whole town of Charlestown. And that was just, imagine burning a whole town down. So that was really created a huge upset in Boston. And so he was also a judge during the court plea during the war, and he ended up was an important person trying to help rebuild Charlestown after the war. We also had Isaac Smith. Oh, geez, he was a merchant. He was the uncle of Abigail Adams, Abigail Smith Adams. So obviously he may have even known Cranch. I know sometimes Cranch was an incredible letter writer. So aside from this quickly is that if you went to London on whatever, Cranch would send you a letter. Hey, listen, I want all this watch stuff. And if it went there, he'd get another letter saying, hey, did you find that watch stuff yet? And he actually bugged Adams, this Isaac Smith's son. Hey, I want this French book. You got to get this book for me when you're in London. So he used all his resources trying to get watch repair parts and whatnot. So separate from my talk. But he also dealt with loyalists. So, it was a very, very partisan era in Boston. We have the Patriots and the Loyalists. You've seen all those movies about what's going on. It was a very contentious period. And so, there was this Thomas Fluker. He was a merchant, wealthy, legislature. Things got so bad, he left Boston. This Benjamin Halliwell, who was a shipbuilder, and he was a commissioner of customs, and he was one of the most attested citizens in Boston because the Loyalists, merchants, got some favors from the royal governor and the commissioner of customs, and there was a lot of animosity. Like John Hancock was a wealthy merchant, and he was just always mad because he was always getting extra on fees for bringing products in, or a ship got confiscated. It was like he really got pretty upset about these guys. But anyhow, Governor Thomas Hutchinson, royal governor, he was a customer. He repaired Hutchinson's son's watch. The Oliver family, they were well connected to the Hutchinsons. He worked on all their watches. This James Russell Jr., he was the son of James Russell. He was a loyalist. He fled to England. So this conflict fractured families, fractured friends. Jonathan Sewall, he was a classmate of John Adams at Harvard. He was a buddy of after post-college for a while, of Adams and Cranch. And this story about them going out, had a few drinks together and discussing things. So they were all buddies, but that all parted because of this conflict. And so he was the last Attorney General of Mass Colony, and he fled to England. So really, we don't realize there's really fractured friendships and families over this, whether you want to separate or stay with England. Looking at the customer database, these were 10 customer watches that Cranch worked on at least 3 times, some as many as 6 times. And these watches were a pain. They had all kinds of problems. They broke down. They needed a lot of maintenance. These are like Italian race cars. They're always in the shop. And so, Cranch worked really hard to them. And so, but of these watches, out of 10, he got to run at least one 18 to 24 month interval. And that's an incredible achievement. Because I'm going through the Bemis database, I saw the same thing, and you're going to need to get constant cleaning. You're probably going to have to have, because the oil gums. Whoops, wait, you stopped again. Oh well. Yep, no, so I guess it's okay. And they need a lot of work. So at least he could keep these watches running. Running out of time, Howard. Okay, we're done. Again, he had a lot of important political. The thing was that this Daybook is incredible because we get a look at what was going on prior to the war. He had over 1,000 customers in the area, and we get a good glimpse of what was going on. And there was so much. It was amazing how far watches traveled, And you know, there's so much information you can mine on a database. I just brought a few things today, so thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Thank you.